So what we will do in a few minutes is I will back up and help us know where we've come from in this series, just to lead us to where we are today and then moving into today's text. So today we are looking at the prophet Ezekiel. So let's just start out. I would love to know from any of you what you know about the prophet Ezekiel. I mean, when I say the book Ezekiel, what it is that comes to mind.
Wheel within a wheel.
Wheel within a wheel. What else? Anything else? The bones, the dry bones. Okay. Wheel within the wheel and the dry bones. So let's begin with wheel within a wheel, and I will ask you to turn to the very first chapter of Ezekiel. I don't have a page number. If someone has a page number. 723. Excellent. And we'll be reading two very brief portions of this first chapter. So could I have someone please, and don't worry about pronunciation. I think I said the last time I led you that, you know, a good fake is what all you have to do on a lot of these biblical pronunciations. So actually, Rebecca, would you be willing to read Ezekiel 1 through 6? And then Joy, you're going to pick it up at verse 15 and read through 19. Okay? So Ezekiel 1 through 6.
In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Shebar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually. And in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings.
Okay, let's pick it up at verse, what did I say, 15.
As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleam of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions, without veering as they moved. Their rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose.
Thank you very much. So I want to give you a little more context for this as we move forward through this text. And again, one of the reasons that this is a little discombobulated today is simply because we don't have the PowerPoint. So Casey is running hard copies of the PowerPoint, which you will have in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and launch. So today we are dealing specifically with Ezekiel as a whole. We will be looking in a few minutes at the text for today, which is the dry bones text, which is later in the story. So what I would like to do is just to give you a kind of rehearsal of where we have been that leads us into today's text in this series. So for those of you who have been here regularly, you know that we spent time with the Shema, which is the word to the people of Israel that grounds them in who they are, that the Lord your God is one God. Now, sometimes we forget in our own monotheistic world that we're living in, that the one God idea was really in a context of settings where, in other cultures, where there were many gods. And the polytheistic, but even more fully some of the range of gods that were there. So the idea of one God is a powerful idea, and we could almost do an entire series just on that one idea of one God, and even how the entire sweep of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, really is sometimes standing in opposition, if you will, to cultures that really held fertility gods, for example, all kinds of gods that showed up there. But the one God is where we launch into the historic understanding of the people of Israel. Then we went through Joshua and crossing the Promised Land and coming into the Promised Land, and Joshua's Battle of Jericho that we all know from the songs. Okay? And if you now have, thank you so much, Casey, for doing this. She's remarkable.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
If I could have one too, that would be helpful. Just to, no problem. Thank you so much. So we're looking at the second little box here on the first page. Again, I'm so grateful for you to do this. So we look at the Shema, the new land, and then we do the Joshua. Then we go into some of what we might call went into some of what we call the theological problem of the conquest. Then we moved into the kingdom, the establishment of the monarchy. And then we had a full New Testament overview. Then we had Micah. That was the week, I believe, that Nanette Sawyer led on Micah. And then the fall of Jerusalem. That was me. The last one I got was the fall of Jerusalem. So I'm always getting devastation in everything I'm doing. Either it's the devastation of the temple, or now it's the devastation of the people that are living in exile. Yeah. And then last week I preached on that really hard text. It was all that rapture stuff. So, it's just been kind of one of those years getting dealt the interesting hand here. And then Judy Watt spent some time with us looking at Psalm 137 and the exile and difficulty of being a people without temple or land. So then if you would turn to the next page, which the box reads Timeline from Moses to Nehemiah. Again, this is just contextual. I'm not going to walk all the way through this, but you can see the sweep not only through what we've done, but the Exodus, wilderness walking, moving through the period of Judges, on down to King David, King Solomon, which we were talking about, and then I'm moving fast, then the destruction of the temple in 587, the Babylonian exile, and then moving in 538, the beginning of the return. Now, where we are today is right in that sweet spot, if you will. Well, actually, it's not even, it's even prior to, or it kind of comes in between 722 and 587, when Ezekiel was likely born. He was most likely taken into exile not in 587, but in the earlier exiles. So there were many different times when people were captured, taken away, and they think it probably was around 598. Now you remember when we're moving in the BC that we're moving from larger numbers to less numbers. Okay, it goes the opposite way. Okay, so today we'll pick up where Ezekiel was, and he most likely then prophesied to the people who were in the range of exiles. So the earlier exile in 598, and then the big one when the temple completely was dust in 587, and the bulk of the people were taken away. Okay, keep going. I also wanted to pull back those two maps. A little harder to see here, but again, very grateful to have this in front of us. And you remember there was both Israel and Judah, and Israel is the northern kingdom and Judah is the southern kingdom. Judah is in the south, and that is where Jerusalem resides. So again, we could go into a lot of detail on all of this, but we won't today. And then the last slide of a map at the bottom of page 3 is the route, if you will, the route or route that they were taking to move from essentially the exile through Aram and then over into Babylonia, the Babylonian exile. Okay, so now we come to today, which is on page 4 here. And this is today's book, Israel is Reborn. And then the next slide, these are supposed to be large slides. But the next slide is the historic context for Ezekiel. And I'm going to do some, I just want to talk with you a bit about what that is. But the sweep of that is destruction, Babylonian captivity, and exile. So we're sitting in exile right now with our friend Ezekiel. So who is Ezekiel? Well, let me give you some information about him. He was a priest whose ministry extended to fellow exiles probably from about 593 BCE to about 563. Ezekiel provides, and this is interesting, so if you're interested at all in historic chronology, this book is one of the most accurate chronologies, in other words, what the sweep of years were of any book in the entire Hebrew Bible and probably in the whole Bible. Why that was, we don't know, why he was so interested in the years, but I think it's really fascinating to think about it, that when people are in exile, away from the known, in places where there isn't a kind of life sweep, sometimes people default, I would say, back into being very clear about dates and times. So you can imagine people who may be coming to the end of their lives, people who have had very full lives, and how many people go back and they know the exact hour and day of what happened to them on a particular era of their life. I think it's a good example of a way and why it might be important for someone like Ezekiel, who was in exile at that point, along with his people, and felt so strongly in the narrative. We don't know if this was a written narrative or an oral narrative or a collection of sermons. We don't really know what the actual delivery system was for this, but what we do know is that he was a priest. So he was both a priest and a prophet. And so we see a lot of markers of what it meant to be a priest, but it was most likely that his early years, his formative years, were spent in Jerusalem around the temple. And of course, this was before the temple was destroyed, but it was a really rough time at that time. And his formative years would have been in the milieu of liturgy, learning, and piety of the Jerusalem temple. And then we think about 598, maybe a little bit later, he was one of the first to be hauled off to Babylon. Okay? So I think it's hard for us to kind of understand what the role of priests were back then. They weren't only holy people sort of hanging out in the Holy of Holies, although that was part of their work. And also, the priesthood back then was inherited, so it came through families. So it wasn't like me, granted, my great-grandfather was a minister, but it doesn't necessarily come through families, but then it did come through families. It was an inheritance. So we know that he probably was of a long line of priests, okay? However, he also was called, as Rebecca just read to us in that first text, that he was called to be a prophet. So to stand at that intersection between priest and prophet is sort of interesting. And also, I think what I really want to say about that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the psychology, if you will, of this book, because it's a very interesting book. But he reported strange experiences of bilocation, so being able to be in one place but kind of having a sense of another. So we see this in the book. We see experiences of levitation. You all know what that means? Anybody know anybody who's levitated? Actually, my husband's uncle literally had experiences, he reported, of levitating. That he was up off the ground, he'd be in a deep meditative state and literally be lifted off the floor. Okay. I know where we are. I do realize where we are in our own thinking, but this is what was reported. And I kind of stand in an interesting spot with a lot of this. Telepathy, mental telepathy, knowing what's going to happen over there, knowing what's going to happen know what is happening somewhere else, but being here. So I guess that's sort of like bilocation, that your brain is kind of like bilocation. Okay, anyway. And he also had, if you read the entire book, which I would encourage you to do, maybe after Christmas. Only because, it might be helpful in January more than now. But he reported experiences of intemperate and uncontrolled language that may be a physical or psychosomatic disorder. Do you all know what Tourette's syndrome is? Yeah. Tourette's syndrome. He may have had Tourette's. We don't know. He may have been schizophrenic. He may have had epilepsy. There's a place in the early reading of this where he literally couldn't move. It makes me wonder if he was epileptic, but that doesn't, none of those necessarily have any big explanation in terms of who he was. But, cannot dismiss him at all, even if these were factors in his own life and experience. Sometimes people would say, oh, well, just kind of weird, kind of, crazy or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that often prophets who are in touch with God sometimes were deemed mad, the kind of mad prophet. And I think it's really important in our own life and situation that when people are kind of going to what we might call an edge or saying things that might not square with exactly the kind of structural way that we understand our faith, to listen again might be what some of the message of Ezekiel was. Because in some ways he also offered the most cogent, intelligible, and engaged reality with what it meant to be in exile and what it meant to be moving out of exile into kind of a replenishing and reappropriation of life. Okay, very quickly. So that's a little bit about him. How is the book structured? We'll talk about that for a moment.
Quick question about this slide, the vision.
Yeah.
Is that a little scroll being handed to him?
Let me just look at
This little hand sort of tapping.
Yeah, that's the scroll being handed to him. Actually, hold on just a second. I just have to figure out where we are. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay? Yep. We'll read a little bit about him eating the scroll. That's another one that you all didn't know happened. Okay? So we are again on page 5. How is the book structured? That's the next question. The book is structured sort of in 3 chunks. I won't go through it in a lot of detail, but chapters 1 through 24 are oracles of warning. So just like so many of the prophets, they understood the cultural context they were in, felt very strongly that they needed to get the message to the people as quickly as possible that things were not good. And so a lot of the warning were focused on before the fall of Jerusalem. There was a lot in these first 24 chapters that really did throw a lot of negative emotions, anger, disdain, indignation. He was not a happy fellow in terms of what he saw happening, but probably really frightened. I think it's hard to imagine what it's like to be in a situation where you're watching things just go down the tubes. Just be kind of devastating, and to watch it and know that it's happening. Yeah. And to stand in the midst of the people and not be and feel so terrified of what they're seeing and watching and feel so helpless. And so in a way, what do? Sometimes you just get really upset and really angry and probably say things you wouldn't normally say. Yeah, Margaret.
This reminds me of the part in Isaiah 40 where Isaiah says, have you not known, have you not heard? Isn't anybody hearing this message?
Yeah, yep. And that's interesting you say that, because a lot of the text that comes up here isn't Isaiah, but actually Jeremiah, who was the raging prophet. And in many ways, much of Ezekiel's work and much of his message aligns very much with some of the other prophets. But that's right. Have you not known? Have you not heard? You know, the Lord our God is one God, etc.
Have you not heard? I'll tell you then.
I'll tell you then, exactly. And he did it in some pretty powerful ways. So the first 24 chapters are the oracles of warning, and then 25 through 32 chapters are oracles against warning of the people of Israel, and then the next one is oracles against foreign nations. This is probably written right after the fall, those 25 through 32 oracles, and then chapters 33 through 48 are oracles or statements of hope that again were after the fall, but God was coming to say, it may look like it's all wreckage, but I'm about to do something new. So that's where we're going today. We're not going to stay with devastation too long. So then we move to slide 10, which you wouldn't know which one that is. It's entitled Ezekiel's Vision. And so the vision of Ezekiel had 3, maybe 4 visions, 3 definitely, and there's some thought of another one that might have been visionary too, and sees the manifestation of the divine presence in the earthly location, the inner sanctuary of the Holy of Holies in the temple. Now, if Ezekiel spent the first part of his life kind of in the temple, then was uprooted and taken over to Babylon, there was always a longing for the Holy of the Holies of the temple. But what happens in Ezekiel is that it's very interesting that his message is that it moves the kind of location of God, which was understood to be very, very founded or located in the Holy of Holies at the center of the temple that only priests could go into. And there was certainly other indications as well, that God also traveled with the people, God was in the Ark of the Covenant, God was, in all these places, but it really was the traveling God that then wound up when the temple was built by Solomon, that God was there. So what happens here is that with Ezekiel being moved out of Jerusalem into Babylon, that he also becomes a kind of transitional figure, if you will, for the message that God also has moved out and moved into a new culture, moved into a new place. And where is that place? That God resides with the people, Israel. So the people, Israel, have been in exile, so where is God? God has moved out into the desolation of the exile. It's such an interesting, powerful, that'll preach kind of reality. So he is commissioned as a prophet in the temple, as I'm kind of going back and forth here. His priestly role is quite evident in the legal formulations that you'll see in here, ritual law, the prominence of a visionary throne, where God is located, etc., historically, but then the movement. Okay, and then some of the, talk about the strange symbolism, you all remembered 2 of them, which was the throne of the chariot of God in chapter 1, and the throne of the chariot of God is this. Some would say, and some have speculated, that he literally saw a flying saucer that came down from the heavens, arrived, the wheel within the wheel, and, had this vision of something that was very, very powerful. But he did not think it was aliens, space aliens. He thought it was the manifestation of God. Very key and crucial point, because I think what happens is that so often people kind of get into the 21st century view and think, oh, well, that's what's going on. I mean, none of us necessarily would do that. You would know this is historic. I don't mean to insult anybody. But there's also the sense of, oh, well, there's always been these manifestations of kind of extraterrestrial, phenomenon, and this is one of the first. And that's not in the understanding of what really Ezekiel thought was happening. He thought it was just this absolute manifestation of the one who created the entire universe, right there, right there coming to him. So then we have the word prophesy. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm bumping ahead. Then we have the eating of the scroll. So, since you brought it up, could you please read Ezekiel 2:8 through 3:3?
I got it.
2:8 through 3:3. I think it's
Okay,
not
yep.
hugely long. Okay.
But you mortal, hear what I say to you. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. I looked, and a hand was stretched out to me, and a written scroll was in it. He spread it before me. It had writing on the front and on the back, and written on it were words of lamentation and mourning and woe. He said to me, O mortal, eat what is offered to you. Eat the scroll, and go, speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. He said to me, Mortal, eat the scroll that I give you, and fill your stomach with it. Then I ate it, and in my mouth it was as sweet as honey.
Okay. So, so interesting. What's really interesting about this is that in the tradition of the bar and bat mitzvah, when children learn the Hebrew language in preparing for their bar and bat mitzvah at age 12, there's a moment very early on when the rabbi gives a little chunk of paper and puts honey on it and hands it to the child to eat. And it's, I know, it sounds a little weird, but it is really powerful to think of the sweetness of the word. And so, you know, I'm sure it arises out of this particular text. But you all didn't know that he ate the scroll, did you?
Even though that's the beginning of Reader's Digest.
Yes. Say more about that. The beginning of Reader's Digest, what? Oh, just... Oh, no. It's really funny. The college I worked at in Minnesota was basically got millions of dollars from Reader's Digest because the founder's dad was one of the presidents. Yeah, exactly. I've driven by Reader's Digest. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for reading that. Okay. So we have some strange practices foregoing the customary rites at mourning the death of his wife, who was the light of his life, the most beautiful person he'd ever known, and he forewent the ritual mourning of her. Why? We don't know. We don't know whether the intersection of vision and ritual came together because he was both a prophet and a priest. Or whether he was confounded by the disorienting experiences of being exiled to Babylon. So was he really a victim or a person who was having post-traumatic stress of being uprooted and moving? I mean, we don't know this, and it's not like we can ever put ourselves back into that, but I think it gives us some understanding of the kind of intensity of what was going on in that particular time in history. So now we come to today's text, which is Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14. So who would like to read that text? Great.
The hand of the Lord came upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them. There were very many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. He said to me, Mortal, can these bones live? I answered, O Lord God, you know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I had been commanded, and as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, mortal, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood on their feet, a vast multitude. Shall I go on?
Yeah, just going down
Okay.
to 14. Thank
Okay.
you.
Then he said to me, mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. Therefore prophesy, and say to them, thus says the Lord God, I am going to open your graves, and bring you up from your graves, O my people. And I will bring you back to the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from your graves, O my people. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you on your own soil. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act, says the Lord.
Okay. You all are familiar with this text. You probably have heard sermons on it. But I think the difference in preaching a sermon about this text and doing a class like this is that you can kind of land in the deeper reality of what the devastation was that these people were dealing with and how much this vision of Ezekiel in the Valley of the Dry Bones really did become a kind of path out, if you will. I mean, think about this. I can imagine that there are many, many, many places historically where this image of the Valley of the Dry Bones has been a sustaining, if you will, energy for people who have been in very devastating times. I mean, we can think of places like Rwanda, for example, just as for starters, or certainly people coming into the death camps of World War II, the soldiers who came in and just realized, and can these bones live, would be a message and a question that we can't even fathom the power of. The bones, and then what's interesting is that those first verses up to where you stopped, up to 1 through 10 are the kind of prophetic moment, and then 11 through 14 are the interpretation, which is such a classic process with a lot of prophets as well as Jesus, as he would tell a parable or something and then explain it. So this is the explanation. So the symbolism, of course, is that the bones are exiles who have no more hope of resuscitating the kingdom of Israel than putting flesh on a skeleton and calling it to life. The dry bones make death real, as it's there. The dead are strewn across the valley. These are not just dead people that, it's not a cemetery, they didn't get around to burying. These are probably people who were victims of the exile, being carried off, didn't make it to Babylon, and just the bones were just sort of left dryly in whatever this valley was. We're not told exactly where the valley is. And the vision in verse 14 is the reestablishment of Israel indirectly, as it anticipates even the doctrine of the resurrection. So we begin to see some of the, go ahead, Joe.
I've been thinking about your initial comment that this book is really the most historically accurate in terms of times. And it strikes me that, I wonder if that was in a way deliberate. You have a lot of historical accuracies, so for people at that time, then when you have this vision of the dry bones and coming back to life, you would also think, oh, that's also, it's in a realistic context, so perhaps also I can believe that this is something that will happen in the future.
Excellent. Yes, that's exactly right. And I think it's so interesting. That's such an interesting comment, because I think that so often we kind of think of the resurrection and the second coming, if any of us are there, or all of these sort of what we might call ahistorical kind of moments in our lives that, or thoughts about the future and about what's coming, or even, the birth of Jesus that happened then, but we kind of reenacted, if you will, throughout history. That I think what Ezekiel is trying to do is to say this is real. That this is not something that's just sort of pie in the sky, maybe someday it would happen, but that this is coming. And that God is a God of history. Not only is God one God, but God is a God of history that acts in the human life and enterprise throughout history. And so it's exactly on target. So I'd like to now, if you would, take a few minutes to let you just turn to a couple people. You can kind of find 3 folks to turn to. And I have what I'd like for you to do before you turn is on slide 13, which is entitled A Notable Pattern. It's on page 7, and then your discussion questions are under there. The notable pattern that shows up in this and so many of our texts within the scripture is this move from devastation, destruction, to pause, exile, silence. You can use those all 3 kind of in different ways, but also, this sort of process. And then the prophetic breaking of the silence, and then the promise that comes of that. So what I'd like for you to do is to stop for a moment, press pause, and think about in your own life or in the social and political history that we all have participated in or know, how have you seen this pattern play its way out? Of starting out kind of in devastation, in upset, concern, something happens that you don't expect, a partner dies or a child dies or somebody goes through a terrible addiction or, you can name it, but, or even just the kind of psychological pieces that all of us are holding. So where have you seen this happen? And then cite moments in our political history and social history. And then look at the other questions that I asked. Does it take devastation? My question is, does it take devastation, exile in one's personal, social, historic life to bring God's promise? That is a very important theological question, and not one that I really have much of an answer for, so maybe you will in your circle. So if you would circle up for I'll give you about 8 minutes to talk about these in maybe 3, 3, 3, and 3, and if you want to join that group, that'd be great. Just to move your chairs around. Don't be afraid to move it. So, all right, so do we have an answer to the question? Do we have an answer to the question, does basically God, do we need devastation and exile in order to be able to come into the promised land here? This is the question. Sometimes we do. Okay, so what did you say?
Not necessarily just
Just one at a time.
devastation, but we thought that for personal growth, some level of devastation or loss, it propels us, motivates us to look and get the hope needed to accept the coming.
It gives us endurance and character.
Exactly.
Yep, there you are. Yeah. How about this group back here? Did you have any?
What occurred to me was that last message from Wendy Geffen in the Michigan Avenue Forum, when she told the story of Hagar and Ishmael, which, she said, when Hagar and Ishmael, when Sarah predestined them to go to the desert and presumably die with the skin of water, and she was so devastated that she went off to the side and just through this veil of tears, and suddenly had this vision of a well or a spring. And the interpretation that Rabbi Geffen gave was in the Hebrew interpretation. It isn't that a source of water mystically appeared; it was always there. It was just that she couldn't see it through her tears. And so that, when I read this, that's what I thought of too, is that we have opportunities, we have promises that are always there. Sometimes we just don't see them.
That's good.
Yeah, that was just a lovely thought from her.
That'll preach.
And I think adding to that, we're both Stephen ministers, we're helping our care receivers to see the grace of God Yeah, that it wasn't just, oh, I suddenly, had a vision of what's going on, and I'm now in charge. No, God was very slowly moving in our lives, and you have to look for God's grace. It doesn't just hit you like a lightning bolt.
Right.
And maybe it's not what you asked for. Stop trying to tell God what to do. Ask God to help, and it will be different. God moves in this,
Well, I would add to that the two of you are Stephen ministers. Any other Stephen ministers here? The two of you are. And your accompaniment in that process is also crucial. I think we really are kind of in a culture of individuality, and we all think we got to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we got to get it all together ourselves. And to have faithful sisters in the faith who are willing to accompany and to be present is also absolutely one of the biggest gifts we can have. So thank you for your service, both of you, in the work that you're doing.
Yes.
I think in our group, I experienced some devastation with a sudden death of the son of people that were serving coffee, a wonderful group that I go to out in Evanston. I was just absolutely devastated of an early death of a son. We don't know how he died, and that was very sad. But I tried to focus since then on trying to just look to God to try to lead me as normally as possible through devastation, through things that upset me. Yeah, because I think that God rewards us by doing this, and it makes us feel better if we can proceed normally through things. Yeah, that's leading it to the promises of grace that are sufficient for our needs.
Yeah. Thank you, Sue.
The
group back here. Or was there something else from your group that?
Yeah.
One experience that I've had since the devastating loss of my dad last March is that sometimes I dream about a particular poem that he recites every January. And there was one time when I was thinking about it or dreaming about it, I wasn't quite sure. Most of the times I've heard this poem recited, it was Dad reciting it. I've been elected to recite it in January. And so when I started hearing it, I couldn't remember if I had the verses in the right order. I got up, I got the book, and I started reading it out loud. And every time I put the least wrong pronunciation on something, I could hear my father's voice.
That's an amazing story.
That's
very
And I don't know if it fits the model, but I can't help thinking of Israel saying, "Tell me the story again. Tell me the story again." And getting to hear the father's voice that way.
I guess I was just, back to this question, we didn't chat about it, but I was trying to figure out kind of how I had this visceral reaction to saying absolutely not to this question. And I think, but I was listening to what the senior minister back there, I think to me, maybe the better question, at least for me, is does it take devastation exile to recognize God's promise?
There you go.
Because God's promise does not come out of devastation. God's promise is, and it's above devastation, and it's above joy. And if you look at heaven, there isn't going to be devastation. So that's not devastation is not what we're intended for. It's an output of, I think, what happened with Garden of Eden, and all that thing is flung down. And so, but I do think in our broken nature, sometimes it does take it to recognize. That's not to necessarily bring.
Oh, that's fabulous. You know, sometimes in classes, there's just these moments of kind of breakthrough and we teach each other. That's the best of education from my perspective, so thank you.
Our group back there.
Well, we spoke on the cycle and we talked a little bit about the racial cycle, and we mentioned that out of the devastation of the riots of the 60s in Chicago and all that time, a high school came out of it that, was, named after civil rights leaders and Whitney Young. And we talked about how, that same, you just mentioned, that devastation, leading hopefully to growth, in ourselves personally, and societally. And politically.
And I said, a certain maturity too of the Whitney young students as I went through one of the tunnels, you know, underground, transferring through the red and blue line.
Beautiful. Okay, well, we are at our time, so let's actually, okay, one more thing. The last question, or the last couple of questions, well, the closing summary. Wouldn't know what that was going to be, but I think it'd be kind of fun for you to think about how you would tell this story to a friend or to a child, and you know, what would be the themes of this of the dry bones that you might be able to put into a kind of cultural context of our lives today. You know, what are the places where we're kind of where we get led to those places of seeing, you know, the kind of challenges of life, and then what arises, what is the kind of spectacular vision that arises in our lives that help us be able to see beyond, and then where does that get carried into a community? You know, because what we don't have here is then Ezekiel going back to the community and in this text and telling them what I just saw. And you could imagine that there would probably be the naysayers who would say, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? No. But there probably would also, because they're looking around at dry bones, not only in a valley, but in their lives. And then them coming back, him coming back and saying, no, I saw this, and we are going to be let out. And we're not only going to be let out of people who have life, breath in us, the breath of God, but we are going to get let out into new life and new community and a new temple and a new people. So what an incredible thing.
So I don't need to talk before I talk to them.
Well, I sometimes start preaching, so sorry. It just happened. Yeah, Margaret, what did you want to say?
The breath is a theme.
As some people may not know, I'm searching for a new job. And there are times when I just have to get a lot of emails out, a lot of notes out to say, I'm looking, do you know anything? Let me know if there's anything. Here's something new that I put together as a portfolio, all kinds of different correspondence. There was one day when I got all sorts of answers back. And I looked at, when did I write to this person? When did I write to that person? When did I write to the other person? 3 different days. It was all different times when I put the questions out and the answers all came together.
Interesting.
So I think if I were telling this to a friend at the Career Transition Center, I'd say, well, we've got the dry bones right now. Maybe today we're just going to get the toe bone connected to the football.
I love it. I love it.
The devastation, the bottom up.
That'll go into the ear for the day. Let's close with prayer. Gracious God, we are so thankful that you are a God that is a God of the miraculous, of the fullness of the human enterprise and on this earth. And we are so grateful for every person in this room and for their lives and for the way that they trust in you so fully. And so grant in this season of hope and waiting that our lives would be aware and waiting for your grace and your love to prompt us into action in this world that brings hope and wholeness. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for being here.
Yes,
I'm glad.